curious to talk about membership in writers groups and weighing the benefits one gets against not only the financial cost in some cases of belonging, the time commitment to being an active member, and bragging rights, if it's a bragging rights kind of thing, and factoring in the guilt of not taking advantage of what a writers group has to offer.
In those moments of overwhelm, I find at the end of the day, when I have focused on either writing more books or bringing more money into the company, then the overwhelm just goes away. And the stuff that wasn't actually important just is gone. Like it self-selects, and then the business stays healthy. So it's a different view on it, but it's another way to look at it.
Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello, Reflectives, and welcome to episode 258 of the Stark Reflections podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. In today's episode, I have a selection of highlights from the June 2022 Reflective Hangouts. These are hangouts that I have with my patrons, and I normally do one a month. I missed some of the previous months because of some personal things going on, and so what I decided to do is make it up by doing 3 in the month of June. So what you're going to hear are some highlights from 3 of these Reflective Hangouts. Now, the Reflective Hangouts are basically myself hanging out with whichever patrons pop in at the pre-scheduled time. I post that over at patreon.com/starkreflections, where my patrons have access to the Zoom call, etc. And then we just hang out. And sometimes there's a specific theme of things that we're going to talk about. I usually have a note of what I plan on talking about. Oftentimes, some of the patrons will say, I'm going to be there and I'd love to talk about this. But it's just really a great chance for us to reflect together. So these are highlights from the clips because my patrons, of course, get to hear the entire hour-long chat. And they're over at patreon.com/starkreflections. And these are going to be some highlights. So, all my listeners can sort of benefit from some of the reflective chats. This is almost like a clip show because I am in the midst of a lot of travel this summer. And so this is one of those clip shows that I'm putting together to make sure I get a new episode out every week. So you're going to hear highlights from Friday, June 10th. That was myself with Maddie Dalrymple, Roland Denzel, and Katie Cross. On Wednesday, June 15th, Roland Denzel and I were chatting. And then on Sunday, June 26th, it was Roland Denzel and Kathy Mack and myself. So again, this is the highlights of some of those Reflective Hangouts. Now, the next Reflective Hangout is scheduled for Saturday, July 23rd, 2022 at 11 a.m. Eastern. And if you are a patron, go over to patreon.com/starkreflections and you'll see a posting with a link to the Zoom chat, and I'll see you there, or not, or I'll be by myself and I'll just be recording some sort of reflection that'll go back to the patron. So this is just a thank you special bonus for my patrons. And if you are a patron, of course, all of those other episodes, the full conversations will be in the Patreon feed. And for you, dear listener, these highlights so you can benefit from some of the wisdom of my awesome patrons on the podcast. So just going to do a quick ad read and then we will jump into the highlights. And since this is a special episode and it's kind of reflective all the way through, I will not be doing a post interview kind of reflection. I'll just be signing off. So thank you so much for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. This is Mark Leslie Lefebvre. I am currently up in Levack, Ontario on many of the trips that I'm going to be doing over the summer. You probably can hear that the acoustics here in the kitchen in the house where I grew up in are not quite as nice as the ones I have back at home. But that's only for those discerning listeners who are picking up on that slight echo. But again, thanks for listening. Without further ado, going to jump into the ad read from our sponsor and then go right into the short highlights of these Reflective Hangouts. This episode is sponsored by Findaway Voices. Now, over on the Findaway Voices blog, there's a June 16th blog post titled, Audiobooks See 10 Years of Double-Digit Growth. Now, the Audio Publishers Association reports 25% revenue growth in 2021. The audiobook industry is growing, many thanks to the authors fueling that growth by writing great books that people love to listen to. The audiobook market saw 74,000 audiobooks published in 2021, and revenue grew 25% to $1.6 billion, marking a 10th straight year of double-digit growth, according to the latest Audio Publishers Association report. Authors using Findaway Voices have contributed a significant amount of titles and growth to the industry. This continuous trend is great news for indie authors and publishers, especially those in the romance genre, which the APA reports has the most growth with a 75% increase in revenues, followed by self-help at 34% and science fiction at 32%. This is interesting if you're paying attention to the trends in ebook publishing, because often it is obviously romance at the very top, and then you have mystery and thrillers, science fiction, fantasy, etc. So interesting to see that nonfiction self-help so high in the audiobook space. So again, different platforms, different formats, different opportunities for different titles and potentially different authors. If you're interested in more information, there's a link over at the blog.findawayvoices.com with a link to the full APA report. And Findaway Voices, of course, is excited to see all of these positive industry trends, because Findaway Voices is committed to help pushing the acceleration of the entire industry with tools, reach, and opportunities to authors all over the world. And if you want to see how you can leverage Findaway Voices as an author to be part of these trends, to be part of pushing the industry forward, you can check out Findaway Voices over at starkreflections.ca/Findaway. Okay, so I lied. I am going to talk a little bit before we jump into the main content. But I just wanted to say, as I was listening back to edit and clean up that last little bit of the introduction, I realized just how critically important a pop filter is on your microphone. I had the microphone really close to my mouth, and you can hear the popping and the odd sounds that are normally filtered out by just that. I've got actually two. I've got a little foam cover that goes over top of the microphone at home, not on this mini one I'm traveling with. But then I also have an additional pop filter that swings out in front of it on an arm, and oh my goodness, it's amazing how well they work. You wonder why people use them all the time. So this is just sort of my awkward way of apologizing for the lack of a pop filter and you know, the cleanliness of the audio. Not as much of an echo as I thought, but obviously not the best acoustics, and so my apologies. I will do my best to get a little filter for this traveling mic so that when I am on the road and using this, it's not quite as substandard as I wanted it to be. But without further ado, let's get on to the highlights.
I'd be curious to talk about membership in writers groups and weighing the benefits one gets against not only the financial cost in some cases of belonging, the time commitment to being an active member, and, you know, bragging rights, if it's a bragging rights kind of thing, and factoring in the guilt of not taking advantage of what a writers group has to offer.
I think it could be anything from, like, you know, you could be part of RWA or like one of their local chapters, to SIFWA, to, like you said, Alliance of Independent Authors. There's like specific ones for thrillers. And then there's like masterminds that you could be a part of, like all the way, so that it kind of works their way down to like things that are very specific about, just get your book done, or there's like your author business. So there's like all big scale. Then there's down to the free ones where, like 20 books, wide for the win.
Right. And that's more of an investment of time and community rather than money. But I'm a member of the Canadian Authors Association, which I pay several $100s a year to be a member of. I was a member of the Ontario chapter of the Horror Writers Association for the longest time. And then I don't know what happened several years ago. I just didn't get to pay my dues on time. I haven't been to the meetings. When I worked in Toronto, there were meetings once a month. We would meet at a pub. And there's only about 8 to 10 people that would gather, or like the same crew, not always the full 8 to 10. And just meeting with them once a month after work was great because I could get over there easily when I worked in Toronto. But when I stopped working in Toronto, it was not as appealing. And I did it more for the sense of community. There was also opportunities that came because you could volunteer to host the HWA table at the big Comic-Con in Toronto. And you would volunteer to do a 4-hour shift or whatever. And then you could put your book, when you were hosting the table, manning or personing the table or whatever you could have your books out and sell them if you wanted to. And another one is I joined the Cambridge Authors Association here in so Kitchener, Waterloo, Cambridge are 3 cities that are all really tight together. They often think of ourselves as a larger, not metropolitan, but a larger area where we're all kind of part of the same community. And even though I live in Waterloo, a different city, they included me as an author because I'm active in the group and stuff. But we just did one of our members, one of the leaders of the organization, connected with the marketing manager at Chapters Indigo, and that's like a Barnes and Noble here. And over the course of the summer, every weekend they're doing events, and they're doing a big group event for a lot of authors who maybe have 1 book each. And then I'm one of the lucky ones because I have 20 books. And some of them are traditionally published, so they've just ordered directly from the publisher distributor. And then the other ones they set up with a consignment form, and I'm doing signing there. And so there's a benefit, I think, to some of those, and I can't always take advantage of them. So I think, Maddie, you were talking about being a member of a local writers group, and you were never able to take advantage of any of the events they did, or what was the deal there?
Well, the one that we were talking about really briefly before we started recording was a Maine-based organization. I live outside Philadelphia, so it wasn't really local to me, but it was an organization I was interested in belonging to because some of my novels are based in Maine, and I kind of wanted to take advantage of the networking opportunity. And it seemed like a great group. They had a lot of events, right. Some virtual, some in person, which of course the in-person ones weren't so useful for me. A lot of educational opportunities and opportunities to submit books for various things through the organization. And I would get this enormous newsletter, I think weekly. And it was almost a case of every time I got the newsletter, it was packed with great stuff, but I got sort of anxiety about it because all I could think of was there are 100 things I could be doing with this organization, and I'm not doing any of them. And I'm paying for the privilege of not doing any of them. And it was all on me. This had nothing to do with any shortcomings of the organization at all. So I ended up discontinuing my membership there after a year, just because it was causing me more angst than it was causing me benefit.
I'm trying to figure out, how do we deal with that anxiety of, okay, 100 things came in. How do I filter it down to prioritize just the 1 or 2 I may be able to do? And maybe if I identify 2, I can only do 1, or maybe I can't even do any, but I don't know. Because I think isn't it a good problem to have?
Are you familiar with Austin Kleon? So he has a really good email that he sends out every Friday of like 10 things that I think were cool to share this, that I want to share with you this week. And I would tell authors, hey, if you need something to talk about to your own email list, like go ahead and like just open up Austin's and look and pick like one of those things. And several people said, I can't even look at his email because he sends 10 things. It's like, oh my God, like how am I supposed to go? And I go, well, it's like you can see what they are, like music, classical, art? No. Oh, here's one about writing. Oh, I'm gonna, there's the one. So like you can easily go down there. So like you have to, but it's something where he thinks it's just 10 things and I'm highlighting them so easily so you can pick and choose what you want. It's still overwhelming. So you still have to come up with like your own way of coaching yourself through this thing.
The first thing that comes up for me is an answer to the question of how do you when you're in that place of overwhelm and you don't know what to do, my gut check is what brings money into my company first. And I think that's what I do. I
Okay.
just, so
very business oriented then, rather than, okay, very strategically, mama's got to eat, right?
For sure. Well, I have so many things I could do every day. So I'm either going to do something to have another book for my readers, or I'm going to do something else that brings money into the company. Maybe that's setting out a pre-order or getting some merchandise out that I've been holding off on, or, something else. In those moments of overwhelm, I find at the end of the day, when I have focused on either writing more books or bringing more money into the company, then the overwhelm just goes away. And the stuff that wasn't actually important just is gone. Like it self-selects, and then the business stays healthy. So it's a different view on it, but it's another way to look at it.
I think that brings up another money-making opportunity from conferences, that it's not only the money you're paying out to membership, but I know I've gotten paid speaking engagements because I belong to certain organizations, either with that organization where it's very clear that my membership was sort of a prerequisite to getting that engagement, or, it's the sense I get that I have a certain amount of credibility being a member of these organizations, and maybe that has led to other ones. So fortunately, the money isn't always going just one way into the organization. Sometimes it does come back to you.
I think one of the challenges we have, especially in the access we have to information today, is knowing where to draw the line, because we have this analysis paralysis because there's too much choice. I remember when my son was little, I remember learning not to give him the choice of all the clothes in his closet, but saying the blue shirt or the red shirt, you decide which you want to wear. And when I narrowed the decision down for him, it made it so much less overwhelming for him, because he would have gotten frustrated not knowing what to wear. And so I have to remind to do that to myself, because in many ways I'm like the 3-year-old or 4-year-old who it's like, there's too much to do. I don't know what to do. There's too many squirrels to chase. But I think for me anyways, that sense of community is really important. So for example, I had a meeting earlier today with my Drafted Digital hat on, and the person I was talking to at this company, I thought, oh my God, you need to know Damon Courtney. I got to introduce you to, which I haven't done yet because I've been in meetings all day. But there's that thing that comes in a community where you go, oh, so-and-so and so-and-so, you really need to talk to one another. And I learned this from Robert J. Sawyer, who's a Canadian sci-fi author. And one of the things I love about hanging out with Rob is Rob just seems like his sole mission, and it reminds me of Seth Godin's linchpin, is his sole mission seems to be trying to connect the right people. And I've benefited from Rob connecting me with different people over the years. So I almost feel, okay, when I'm here, if I know so-and-so is into this and so-and-so is into this, oh, I really need to get them to talk. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But I don't know that for me, there's some value. I don't know, maybe that's an intrinsic value when I know I can bring two people together that can hit it off, or maybe they can find some mutual benefit together.
Well, I think that's a really good test for considering whether to join a group or not, because I've belonged to groups where it's very much like that. It's very much about the people who are setting the tone, leading the group, are making those connections and encouraging others to make the connections. And then I've been in groups where it's pretty much every person for themselves. And I don't belong to that second one. And so it's a good way to weed things out. If you feel like there's reciprocal give and take among all the participants in that community, then that's a good way of making that decision about whether you want to be a part of it.
Because one of the things I struggle with is we often hear the same people who do the tours. Like Liz, my partner Liz, is a huge fan of Smart Lists, the podcast with Jason Bateman
Oh yeah.
Will, Sean Hayes, and Will, the Canadian guy, whatever his face is, voice of Batman, Lego Batman.
Oh yes.
So they're all buddies, right? And they started this podcast, and so they have celebrities on. But then she also started listening to Rob Lowe's podcast and all these celebrity podcasts. And she says it's the same guests that just cycle through all the other celebrity podcasts. And one of the things I've tried to do is I've tried to bring in different voices that aren't always on all the shows. And so that's I mean, again, I love the creative pen, and I love the way Joe interviews people. And it doesn't matter if I've heard them before, I will listen to her talk to anyone. And what I was pleased was that my conversation with Brian was slightly different than Joe's, right? So we got into different things, and obviously we're talking about his Kickstarter, and obviously we're going to talk about best page forward, and obviously we're going to talk about the Sell More Book Show. But I just find that kind of interesting, that it can still be somewhat flavorful and different.
Yeah, I was listening. I wish I could remember which podcast it was on, but it was over this last weekend, and they talked about it was. I think maybe it was Sasha Black's. I don't remember. It was because it was a little bit of an older one. I wanted to re-listen to it, and there was a PR person. And at first I was like, PR, like, come on, that's like so olden days, right? And she actually brought that up. Like, people think of PR as like this, like stuff that people did in the olden days, but like PR is, like all these things. So one of the things that she talked about was the importance of asking questions that are different. Like, don't just ask the same questions. Like, it's like, yeah. And it's so true. Like when in my health and fitness podcast, they try to ask people questions that are different, because like if they're coming out with a book, people ask the same things. Tell me about the book, and that's fine. Yeah. But like, I want to have it so it relates specifically to my audience. So like, you ask questions, right. And a lot of times I think that's something that people they forget to do. They ask the questions that they
should ask. Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, you should be asking the questions that are pertinent to the details that you need to pull out of them, which are going to be catered to your audience. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I also think there's some value to, like Sasha has, where she asked the rebel, when name of time you've been a rebel. Yeah. And, like, so there's like some sort of standardized questions that you ask that is like sort of on theme.
Yeah, that's kind of cool. And that's her last question, which is always cool, because everyone has a different response, which is neat.
Yeah. So I wasn't always passionate about health and fitness. That was like a journey of self-discovery. Right. And like, it was like flipping a switch. Like had been sort of yo-yoing all my life. Around 35. I don't know if I've told you the story before, but 35, and my daughter, who was like 3 or 4, I'd have to do the math. She thinks she was 3 or 4. And so we were upstairs watching Cinderella for like the 30th time. And she asked for a glass of water. So I went downstairs, got a glass of water, came back up, and she says, "Daddy, you didn't have to run." And I'm like, I had not run. Apparently I was huffing and puffing like I had run. Yeah. So that was kind of like that was like the moment.
Really, it was the being out of breath from getting the water. And she said, "Daddy, you didn't have to run." And you went, "Wait a minute."
Yeah, because I thought that was such a trivial thing.
Yeah.
Growing up, like that really made me think, and I had plenty to think about, because like I said, it was the 30th time for Cinderella. So I thought about other things for a little while. And then after that, I decided, I should do something, because I want, I had a little son, a little baby at the time as well. And I'm like, I kind of want to be around. But Xerox, I had been a teacher, like I'd been a trainer and a systems analyst and a programmer.
Right.
And so I was passionate about that. I loved that, but like, it's different. It's different. I loved helping, you're helping, it's a lot different. You're helping a big company, print their checks and their insurance policies as fast as possible.
Yeah.
And then also you're working with mom and pops, and some mom and pops print books and things like that, and do bookbinding and all that, and helping them. That was much more satisfying. So that's when I really started getting into, because you can kind of carve your own way in those big companies a little bit, you let your boss know which part of the things you're more interested in. So I started working with smaller companies who wanted to make something of themselves, and that is so rewarding. It's so rewarding. It's so rewarding. And then, so that's kind of like and as an author, so then I was like, I'm a Xerox expert, I'm a color management expert, a workflow expert, and I'm also an author. And I would show them my book, and they were like, wow, like, how did you print this? And I go, well, this was printed on, at the time, it was printed on a Xerox machine in North Carolina from Amazon. And they were like, how can we do that too? So it was kind of nice to just bring that whole circle.
That's cool.
Whole circle. Yeah.
I like what you said about, you can carve your own path within a large, which seems like a corporation that's going to prevent you. It's like, no, you're in this box and thou shall never leave this box. But there is a possibility, right, of finding those little ways of making it fun.
Yeah. Well, and I can't say you can do that with every company, but it was 27 years with Xerox when I left Xerox, and 5 years with USC doing what we called electronic publishing at the day, or desktop publishing back in the day, publishing. Right?
What you can do it right from a computer on your desktop, because laptops were still not a thing.
There was no laptops. But I don't know if you ever saw these, but they, Xerox, there's a whole thing. If you're interested in Xerox, there's a book called Squandering the Future, because they invented all these things and that they just kind of gave away. Because like somebody at Xerox invented the mouse, the graphical user interface.
No, really?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. All sorts of things. The trackpad.
Really? Okay. That was all Xerox inventions. Wow.
And then there's all sorts of things. So when you get into printing specifically, they invented the language that Adobe later turned into PostScript, right? Mm-hmm. It was called, now I can't even, Interpress. Interpress was the Xerox version of this. Then they had another line of printers that had the language that later was taken and or allowed to be taken, because they just gave it away, right? And became HP, HP's language. So which are like still to this day, the two major languages for printing, the HP language, and then there's PostScript. So HP, PCL, and PostScript. And both of those had roots at Xerox. And also the underlying technologies not for Wi-Fi, but deeper than that, TCP/IP.
Okay.
Yeah, TCP/IP, Xerox. Like,
wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing when you actually dig in to see it was kind of funny in a similar vein. I'm a big beer fan, and I remember reading the history of the Molson family. So Molson was one of the two major brewers from Canada, and the Molson family was responsible for the creation of the Bank of Canada. They assisted with the building of the the National Railway, the Canadian Pacific Railway. There's so many different icons and things from Canadian history that the Molson family had a hand in, because they were a very rich family that did a lot, because apparently, there's money in booze, in alcohol, and it was interesting to just see all of this. And it ties back, and you're like, really? It's kind of like what Xerox invented the mouse, the thing that we all use, right? So, the city of Waterloo and Kitchener has some really, really amazing paths. And there's so much green space right in my neighborhood. I only have to walk 3 minutes to be on a nature path, or I can walk 10 minutes in this other way, and I can be in the middle of a green space with this amazing. And there's this one spot. Now this is about a 20-minute walk from my house, but when I get to the nature path, there's streams, there's a river, there's bridges, there's paths that go everywhere. And yes, you can sort of hear the cars in the city, but honestly, you would think you're in the middle of nowhere. And I was thinking, as you were talking about that, becoming aware of, when you fetch the glass of water and you were just becoming aware of something you never thought of. And I began to think about the connection that we have, because I'm up north right now, and I look in 3 blocks that way is wilderness. 3 blocks 1.5 blocks that way is wilderness. 4 blocks that way is wilderness. I'm in the middle of nowhere. Like I would be in the woods. And this is where I grew up. And I took that for granted most of my life, that I could just go, take the snow machine out and take off, or go cross country skiing, and I'd be in the woods in a minute. And now I live in a city, and I just think about how often we go camping, and I just love, Liz loves to sleep in. We stay up late. I'm still up at the crack of dawn because I want to get up and I want to put on the camp coffee. I want to boil the water and have the instant coffee. And I want to sit there, and the one dog will sit at my feet. And of course, I usually have my Kobo, and I'm usually reading a book in solitude. I know it's technology, but at least I can carry 1,000 books on this device.
I think that's a great
way to I bask in the sounds and the feel, and I feel so rejuvenated. And I was trying to think of ways that I could have that more often than when we have to, go on a camping trip, because we don't camp as much as, we can't camp every weekend or whatever. And so I was trying to think of changing my morning routine. I get up, I feed the dogs, I feed the cats, I put on the coffee, do my blood pressure, then sometimes meditate, then do my blood pressure very quickly. And then I start writing before I do anything else. And I'm thinking, I wonder if I should go for a walk somewhere on nature and then do my writing. Will my writing be better? Is that something you've experimented with? Anything like that?
It could be. There are benefits to our circadian rhythm to go outdoors earlier, right? And
earlier in the day, really?
Earlier in the day, yeah.
Okay.
So if you go out, there's 2 important times to go out in the day. If you can go out more than that, but like if you can only go out twice, go out when the sun is up, like whether it's cloudy or not, doesn't matter, because your eyes know where the sun is. They'll sense the rays. And it's not about like the vitamin D or about the UV or anything like that. It's about the signal that the sun gives to your nervous system based on the angle of the sun into your eyes. And so that tells you it's time to get up. And we're up now. Life is happening. The day has begun. Activity, go. And then the other time is towards the end of the day, late afternoon, or even like could be early evening. Where I'm pretty north in Canada and Colorado, you're pretty even more north, right? Yeah. So it gets darker much later. Yeah. And so like it's the signal to your brain that the sun is going down. It doesn't have to be setting. It's just your brain knows it's going down. The day is coming to an end. It's wrapping up. And that will set the stage for you to have a better night's sleep tonight. So as you do this, so it's circadian. So think of rhythm. So it's like, you're not going to notice it right away, but over time, your rhythm will lock into the rhythm of the earth spinning around the sun and all that, and the seasons. And you'll start to sleep better. You'll get up more refreshed. And then your brain should be able to write better. It's not going to work that way for everybody, because some people can get up before dawn and they can write and they get a lot of stuff done, right? Yeah. But it's worth trying to see. Like I
love that idea.
If you like to write after you've started your day more, then it's worth spending 5-10 minutes outside at least. And it can be longer, but I would say like 5 to 10 minutes would be like the minimum. But it's interesting. Like I have Jeff Elkins. He's the dialogue doctor.
Oh yeah.
And so I'm in a group with him. So he did had me send him a chapter, and it was so good, because not only did he help me with my dialogue, like just sort of tightening it up a little bit, but he gave me some great ideas on how this part of this dialogue is so good, but it's only like 3 paragraphs, and it's like an aside. He goes, take this and make it a whole scene by itself, and that's needs to kick off your book. And I'm like, man, why didn't I see that before? Because it solved so many problems for kicking my book off strongly. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah, it's great.
Cool.
So Kathy, you were talking about before we started recording, you wanted to talk about stylistic editing in particular.
Stylistic editing. Yeah. So a few weeks ago, I did, like last year, you did the Writers Federation of New Brunswick Word Spring. You came and did a presentation for that because it was all online. But this year we put it in person, well, hybrid event actually.
Yeah.
And I did a workshop there and on editing. And one of the first questions that I asked people was, when I say editing, what does this mean to you? And we went around the room and I put some things on the board. And like one of them said, well, editing to me means, fixing up the story, making the story right. So that's developmental editing and substantive editing, or however you want to call it. And then later on, you do the proofreading and the copy editing to make sure that everything's correct. And I remember thinking, but in between those two, there's stylistic editing, right? Where you check to make sure that your sentences are active and exciting and that you're not repeating information, that you're trusting your audience to remember stuff. And it's such an important step, but it's so often left out. So I think that I might be carrying a torch for stylistic editing for the next few years, because it's so important.
So it's interesting though, like I was thinking about the last edit on the last book that I had done, and the editor who did the editing did stylistic editing, and it was tightening sentences. It was actually specifically, I remember there's specific things saying, you already said that in a different way 3 paragraphs ago. And also even looking for repetitions and things like that. And that really was it wasn't just a tightening. It was a tightening, but it was also enhancing the characters and the way they interplayed off of one another too. Like, so it took these little bits and pieces, and it just made the whole story and everything that was happening a lot more comprehensive.
Yeah, so it's sort of halfway between a copy edit and a developmental edit. But I mean, when you say developmental edit, you think big changes, and do we really need this character? And is my hero actually
and early?
Yeah, and it's early on in the process.
Yeah.
But if you can take the sentences and make sure that they're active instead of passive, wow, people just get carried along with the story. Or if you check the dialogue and make sure that the different characters have different language, phrase things differently, it just so enhances the reading experience, right?
Yeah.
And that's all at the stylistic level. I mean, the 3 levels of editing, I like to think of them as 3 levels plus proofreading, which is kind of a copy editing plus. but when I think of these three levels, they're not discrete. It's not like I'm doing a developmental edit right now, so I'm not going to fix any typos. No, right?
Yeah.
It's never discrete. But I think if you don't put stylistic as a separate thing, if you don't say, today my focus is going to be on style, then, or this week or this month or whatever it is, then I think the book can really suffer. Yeah, I think it can really suffer. That's part of the thing I was saying about not publishing too soon, right?
Well, as you said, the advances in technology have been so big that I think one of the problems that it has caused is it makes us think that all we need is the technology. So if you can write your book in Word or Scrivener or whatever, you use Pro Writing Aid and Grammarly to edit it, you use Atticus or Vellum to format it, and you use some sort of some sort of cover Canva to create a cover. Yes, you can do all of these things, but that's not, and then you can publish every 30 days and then get it out without ever having to go back and do it. Like, that doesn't mean that you should. So there's we can use technology as these tools to make our jobs easier, but you have to be careful not to rely on them too much, and make sure that not that they know their place, but the proper place and how you can best use them and how you can still it's it gives us a lot of opportunities, but where we 15, 20 years ago, we would not have had those publishing opportunities.
Right.
But if we want our books to last and be I mean, they're going to last because they're never going away for good or for bad, right?
Yeah.
But if you want them to last and keep being purchased for decades and or centuries to come, maybe it's like we have to make them the best they can be.
Yeah, there's something. We're getting down to the very deepest definitions of what creative is, because if we don't have to format the margins on the IBM Selectric computer, right? We don't have to, depend on, we don't have to change the font manually, right? We don't have to do any of that technical stuff. So what we put on the page suddenly gets more and more important, right? And it's very interesting. It's changing what creative means. You go from in the 19th century, military officers were trained in watercolors in order to map terrain because you couldn't just take a photograph, right? And now, not only can you just take a photograph, but you can send it across continents in instants. So the ability to make a watercolor doesn't matter the same way that it used to. And similarly, the ability to have a beautiful book is becoming less and less important. And the content of the book, I think, becomes more and more important, including the style, the writing style. No, that was because that is a bugbear that I have, is people publishing too soon, right? So that if you had published your first book and then written the second one, and then you'd have to live with the things that you did in the first book that don't really work with the second book, or people like it just, I've said this before, it breaks my heart to see people to read a book that isn't as good as it should have been, right? That's almost there, has a great plot, but the copy editing is not as good as it could be, or the style isn't as good as it could be. It just breaks my heart. So I'm really happy to hear that you're waiting till you have the series out and then you're publishing it, so you can go back and make those fixes. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm really I've been publishing things since 2012.
Yeah.
And so I've learned a lot of lessons over the years from that. And also I had like a traditional published book. So I learned some stuff from that. But what really got me into, when I made the decision to go with fiction, I went to the Story Grid. You probably heard of the Story Grid. So I went to a Story Grid event, the very first event they had in New York City. And they were so focused on getting of what a good book that's going to last and people are going to buy for years to come, generations. So it really sort of hit home. So people always say, oh, you should never publish your first book. Well, that's just because you didn't, so I'm not considering, I've written other things too. So, but I want to go back and you can publish your first book as long as you go back and give it the treatment it deserves. Right. So that's why I figured, write the first one, write the second one, outline the third, write other stuff, and then come back. And now I'm going to do it the right way.
Yeah. Things happening out there and how they work with us. And I think passivity is a big part of that. How did we get from stylistic editing to, fixing the world?
Well, no, I want to follow that train of thought, because that's one of the things we do as writers is we absorb so much from the world. I'm just reading Rod Carley, a Canadian author. I'm reading one of his books, and there's a scene in it where this guy and his girlfriend were being intimate with one another on the balcony, and their balcony faced, this is fiction, Margaret Atwood's balcony. And Margaret Atwood came out, saw them, kind of jokingly pretended to hide her face under a towel, and kind of Margaret Atwood sense of humor. So it's probably based on something that happened. But then the scene is that then the woman from that point on read every single one of her books to see if she put it in a book, because it's what we do is we incorporate the things we see, hear, feel in books. Right? I went for a 5-hour walk yesterday, and I, in my head, when I wasn't listening to a book and I turned off the book that I was playing, I was observing and watching and just seeing how people interact with one another, because I know somewhere some of those things are going to come into a book somewhere. I'm not necessarily seeing someone having sex on the balcony across from me, but that's what we do, right? As writers, we observe, and maybe we act. Is that the difference? Do we actively observe as writers as opposed to passively observe?
Oh,
Now we're getting like all
yes.
philosophical.
I think we do. I think we do actively observe. And yeah, I think we do. And I think we really do draw on our experiences. So there's always that disclaimer at the front of books. It says, any resemblance to persons living or dead is purely happenstance, and you've got a dirty mind for thinking of it. But that disclaimer is there on purpose because, in fact, we do draw from our experiences.
Right.
And the line between creative nonfiction and fiction is sometimes really hard to draw. Yeah.
Well, I think I've used the phrase in the ones that I've published myself is either a product of the author's imagination or is used fictitiously or something like that. Any resemblance, because I have actually written about real people, and had to play off of that. Yes, we're just kind of making things up.
I think you take events or take little moments and ascribe them to characters. But that doesn't mean the character is the person that did that thing that actually happened. It just means that this thing happened and it's really funny and it has a little moment, or it's really endearing or charming. And I want to use that. But it doesn't mean that that character is the person that actually did it in real life.
And that is it for the highlights from the 3 reflective hangouts that we did in June of 2022, and that was with Roland Denzel, Maddie Dalrymple, Katie Cross, and Kathy Mack. And thank you to Roland and Maddie and Katie and Kathy for hanging out with me and reflecting and sharing some great moments. I hope you enjoyed listening to this, dear listener. But that is it for episode 258 of the Stark Reflections podcast. So until next week and next episode, this is Mark Leslie Lefebvre wishing you great writing and good Stark Reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.